Deep in Cambodia's jungles stands a temple complex so vast that early European explorers refused to believe local people had built it, insisting instead that it must have been built by Alexander the Great, or the Romans, or some other lost civilization entirely. That temple complex is Angkor Wat, and it is covered top to bottom in carvings of Hindu gods, scenes from the Ramayana, and inscriptions written in Sanskrit, a language whose original homeland lies thousands of kilometers away on the Indian subcontinent. For over a century, historians have known that ancient Cambodia absorbed enormous cultural influence from India, adopting its religions, its writing systems, its royal titles, and much of its artistic tradition. What historians could never fully answer, using texts and temples alone, was a much deeper question. Did this influence spread purely through ideas, trade, and religious conversion, the way culture often moves between distant regions without any real exchange of people? Or did actual Indian populations settle in Cambodia in large enough numbers to leave a lasting genetic mark on the Cambodian people themselves? Recently, a team of geneticists sequenced ancient DNA recovered from burial sites across Cambodia, spanning thousands of years of the region's history, and one specific result from that research did not just answer this old question. It left the historians reviewing the findings genuinely stunned. Cambodia occupies a unique position in the story of ancient Asia, a civilization whose surviving monuments rank among the most breathtaking architectural achievements anywhere in the pre-modern world, built by a kingdom that, at its height during the Angkorian period, controlled territory stretching across much of what is now mainland Southeast Asia. Angkor Wat itself, along with the dozens of other temple complexes scattered across the region, was built not as a simple act of religious devotion, transplanted wholesale from a foreign land, but as the product of a genuinely local civilization that had absorbed, reshaped, and ultimately transformed an imported religious and administrative tradition into something entirely its own. Understanding exactly how that transformation began, whether through pure cultural exchange or through an actual movement of people across the ocean, is not simply an academic curiosity. It goes to the very heart of how one of history's great civilizations actually came into being, and by extension to the heart of who its many millions of modern descendants actually are, and where their own ancestors truly came from. Before we get into what the DNA actually revealed, you need to understand why this question was so difficult to answer using historical sources alone, and why ancient DNA became the only tool capable of settling it with real confidence. Cambodia's written historical record, while extensive by the standards of much of the ancient world, tells us a great deal about religion, royal succession, and monumental architecture, but almost nothing directly about the actual movement of ordinary people. Inscriptions found at temple sites across the country describe kings claiming descent from Hindu deities, court officials bearing Sanskrit names and titles, and religious foundations dedicated to gods worshipped thousands of kilometers away in India. What these inscriptions cannot tell you is whether the people writing them and the broader population surrounding them were themselves descended from migrants who had actually crossed the Bay of Bengal, or whether they were the descendants of indigenous Southeast Asian populations who had simply adopted a foreign religion, a foreign script, and a foreign set of royal customs without any significant movement of people accompanying that cultural shift. This is a genuinely important distinction that historians studying ancient cultural transmission have grappled with across many different regions of the world, not just Cambodia. Written and religious traditions are strikingly good at traveling on their own, spreading through trade networks, pilgrimage, and the simple prestige value that comes from adopting the customs of a wealthier or more powerful civilization. A local king wanting to strengthen his own authority might adopt Sanskrit titles and Hindu religious imagery purely because doing so lent his rule an air of sophistication and legitimacy, borrowed from a distant, prestigious civilization, entirely independent of whether any actual Indian people had ever set foot in his kingdom. Separating out how much of Cambodia's transformation reflected this kind of purely cultural borrowing, as opposed to a genuine movement of Indian people into the region, was simply beyond what inscriptions and temple architecture alone could ever definitively prove, no matter how skilled the historians studying them happened to be, and no matter how many long decades of careful, patient scholarship they eventually devoted to untangling the question. There are 3 questions this investigation set out to answer, and I want you to hold on to all 3 because the way they resolve at the end of this video connects Cambodia's ancient history to a genuinely surprising biological reality, hiding underneath centuries of familiar cultural history. First, what does the deep ancestral genetic history of the Cambodian people actually look like, long before any Indian cultural influence ever arrived in the region? Second, is there measurable evidence of actual South Asian ancestry present within the Cambodian population? Or does the Indian influence found in temples and inscriptions represent culture spreading without any accompanying genetic exchange? And third, and this is the part that genuinely startled the research team, If South Asian ancestry really is present, what specific pattern does it follow, and what does that pattern reveal about exactly how this ancient cultural and biological exchange between India and Cambodia actually took place? Answering these questions required assembling one of the more ambitious ancient DNA sampling efforts ever attempted in Southeast Asia, a region whose hot, humid climate makes preserving usable ancient genetic material considerably more difficult than in the cold, dry environments where some of the best studied ancient genomes elsewhere in the world have been recovered. Researchers worked with skeletal remains excavated from burial sites spanning a period of several thousand years, carefully selecting samples that could be reliably dated, allowing the resulting genetic data to be organized into a clear chronological sequence stretching from Cambodia's earliest known prehistoric populations through the transformative centuries of the Indianization period and into the era of the great Angkorian kingdoms that followed it. Building this kind of time depth into the study was essential, because without a clear before and after picture, researchers would have had no reliable way to determine whether any South Asian genetic signal they found had arrived recently, during the historically documented period of Indian contact, or whether it had actually been present in the region for far longer, for reasons entirely unconnected to the Indianization process historians had already identified through inscriptions and temple architecture. To understand where this investigation begins, you have to look at the deep genetic foundation of mainland Southeast Asia as a whole, a foundation shaped long before anyone in the region had ever heard of India, Hinduism, or Sanskrit. Ancient DNA recovered from some of the earliest known human burial sites across present-day Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam has revealed that the deep ancestry of mainland Southeast Asia was built primarily from two distinct ancestral populations, arriving at different points in prehistory. The first were indigenous hunter-gatherer populations who had inhabited the region for tens of thousands of years, related to some of the earliest human groups to settle Southeast Asia after the initial migrations out of Africa. The second were farming populations who migrated southward into the region from what is now southern China, bringing with them early rice cultivation and a genetic ancestry connected to populations from East Asia, arriving in mainland Southeast Asia sometime within the past 4,000 to 5,000 years. This two-source model of Southeast Asian population history mirrors, in broad structural terms, similar patterns researchers have found repeatedly across other parts of the world. Indigenous populations descended from the earliest waves of human settlement in a given region, later joined and substantially blended with incoming farming populations carrying new agricultural technology and a different genetic ancestry from elsewhere. What makes the mainland Southeast Asian case particularly well documented is the sheer number of ancient burial sites researchers have now been able to sample across the region, from early prehistoric hunter-gatherer sites through the arrival of rice farming communities and into the historic period, providing an unusually complete and continuous genetic record, spanning many thousands of years, a level of chronological detail that made it possible to identify precisely when any later genetic changes, such as the eventual arrival of South Asian ancestry, first began appearing within the sequence, rather than researchers having to rely on a single isolated snapshot in time and simply guess at everything that came both before and after it. Over the following centuries, these two ancestral populations gradually mixed together across the region, producing the genetic foundation that underlies the vast majority of mainland Southeast Asian populations found today, including the ancestors of the people who would eventually build the Khmer civilization at Angkor. This two-layer model, indigenous hunter-gatherer ancestry blending with incoming East Asian-related farming ancestry, has now been confirmed at burial sites across the region through multiple independent studies, giving researchers a clear and well-established baseline for what Cambodia's population looked like, genetically speaking, well before any outside cultural influence from India ever entered the picture. Establishing this baseline mattered enormously for the rigor of everything that followed in the investigation. Without a clear, independently confirmed picture of what Cambodia's population looked like genetically before any Indian contact, researchers would have had no reliable way to distinguish a genuine later arrival of South Asian ancestry from ordinary genetic variation that might simply exist naturally within any long-established population. By first confirming, across multiple burial sites and multiple independent research teams, that Cambodia's pre-contact population showed a consistent and well-defined genetic profile built entirely from indigenous hunter-gatherer and East Asian-related farming ancestry, with no trace of South Asian genetic influence present anywhere in the record, researchers created exactly the kind of clean, well-controlled comparison needed to identify with confidence whatever genetic changes appeared later, once actual contact with India began. This established baseline gave researchers exactly what they needed to properly test the second, and considerably more historically significant, question this investigation was built around. Beginning sometime in the early centuries of the first millennium CE, Historical and archaeological evidence shows a dramatic transformation taking hold across Cambodia and much of the surrounding region, a period historians often refer to as Indianization, marked by the sudden appearance of Sanskrit inscriptions, Hindu and Buddhist religious monuments, and royal courts adopting titles, rituals, and administrative practices directly modeled on Indian precedent. This period coincides closely with the rise of Cambodia's earliest major kingdoms, beginning with the polity historians call Funan, and continuing through the later Chenla and eventually Angkorian periods, each of which incorporated Indian religious and administrative traditions ever more deeply into Cambodian political and cultural life. Funan, generally considered the earliest of these major Cambodian polities, emerges in historical records, including accounts left by Chinese diplomats and travelers who visited the region and documented what they observed. As a wealthy and cosmopolitan trading kingdom deeply engaged in maritime commerce connecting China, India, and the wider Southeast Asian world. Its major ports served as crucial waypoints along maritime trade routes that carried goods, and evidently people, across enormous distances, connecting the spice-producing regions of maritime Southeast Asia with markets in both China and India. It was precisely this kind of bustling, cosmopolitan trading environment, rather than any organized military campaign or systematic colonization effort, that historians have generally believed provided the most plausible setting for sustained contact between Indian traders, religious figures, and the local Cambodian population, a setting the genetic evidence would eventually confirm in remarkable detail, generations, and in this case many centuries, before anyone actually had the scientific tools needed to test whether that plausible historical picture was truly correct. When researchers examined the genetic profile of skeletal remains recovered from burial sites dating to this specific transitional period, comparing them carefully against genetic samples recovered from earlier Cambodian burial sites that predated any Indian cultural contact, they found something that confirmed the historical texts were describing far more than a purely cultural or religious transformation. Individuals buried at sites dating to the Indianization period and afterward showed a measurable and unmistakable component of South Asian ancestry, a genetic signal entirely absent from earlier Cambodian burials, appearing specifically and consistently within skeletal remains dating to exactly the same centuries when Sanskrit inscriptions and Hindu religious monuments first began appearing across the Cambodian archaeological record. The precision of this timing is itself worth appreciating. It is one thing to note, in general terms, that a population somewhere absorbed foreign ancestry at some point in the past. It is another thing entirely to be able to date that genetic transformation with enough confidence to align it, century for century, with an already well-documented cultural and religious shift recorded independently through inscriptions and archaeological remains. This level of correspondence between two entirely separate lines of evidence, genetic data on one hand and written historical and archaeological records on the other, arriving at the same conclusion through completely independent methods, gave researchers an unusually high degree of confidence that they were looking at a genuine historical event rather than a statistical artifact or coincidence of the kind that sometimes complicates ancient DNA research when sample sizes are small or dating is imprecise. This alone represented a genuinely significant finding, confirming, through direct biological evidence, that ancient Indian influence on Cambodia involved considerably more than the spread of ideas, texts, and religious practices alone. Real people, carrying real South Asian ancestry, had arrived in Cambodia during this period in numbers substantial enough to leave a measurable genetic signature within the local population. A signature still detectable within the DNA recovered from burials associated with this transformative era in Cambodian history. But researchers were not finished because when they examined this South Asian ancestry more closely, breaking it down by specific parts of the genome rather than treating it as one single uniform genetic signal, they discovered a pattern that turned this already significant finding into something considerably more revealing about exactly how this ancient cultural and biological exchange actually unfolded. Up to this point, the finding on its own could still have supported multiple different historical scenarios. It might have reflected the arrival of complete Indian families, men, women, and children together, settling permanently in Cambodia in numbers large enough to establish entirely separate communities alongside the existing local population. It might equally have reflected something closer to a genuine colonization effort, with Indian settlers arriving in sufficient numbers and remaining sufficiently separate from the local population to eventually blend more gradually over subsequent generations. Distinguishing between these very different possible historical scenarios required a considerably more detailed look at the genetic data than a single overall measurement of South Asian ancestry could ever provide on its own. The human genome contains several distinct components that researchers can examine separately to trace ancestry along specifically maternal or specifically paternal lines. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down exclusively through the maternal line, tells researchers about a population's female ancestry across many generations. The Y-chromosome, passed down exclusively through the paternal line, tells researchers the equivalent story for male ancestry. When researchers examined these two separate genetic signals within the Cambodian remains carrying South Asian ancestry, they found a dramatic and highly informative imbalance between them. South Asian genetic influence showed up overwhelmingly within the Y chromosome data, indicating substantial South Asian paternal ancestry, while the mitochondrial DNA recovered from the very same individuals showed an overwhelmingly indigenous Southeast Asian maternal signature, largely unchanged from the pattern found in Cambodian burials that predated any Indian contact whatsoever. This kind of asymmetry between paternal and maternal ancestry is precisely the sort of detail that a purely cultural explanation, based on inscriptions and religious texts alone, could never have revealed on its own, no matter how thoroughly historians studied the available written sources. Sanskrit inscriptions describe kings, priests, and court officials, but they say nothing whatsoever about the mothers, wives, and grandmothers of the individuals actually leaving behind these written records. Women whose ancestry, as it turns out, held the key to understanding what kind of migration event Cambodia's Indianization actually represented at the level of ordinary lived experience, far removed from the grand religious and political narratives recorded on temple walls, narratives written, almost without exception, by and about men. This specific pattern, substantial South Asian ancestry appearing almost entirely through the male line while the maternal line remained overwhelmingly local, is exactly the genetic signature researchers associate with a very particular kind of historical migration event, one involving primarily men traveling from a distant source population, arriving among a local community, and marrying local women rather than an entire population, including women and children, relocating together as a unit. In practical terms, this means that Indianization in Cambodia was very likely driven by relatively small numbers of Indian men, most plausibly traders, religious specialists, or administrators traveling along the well-established maritime trade routes connecting India to Southeast Asia, who settled among Cambodian communities, married local Cambodian women, and whose descendants went on to carry Indian religious practices, Sanskrit literacy, and Indian-derived court customs forward into subsequent generations, all while the surrounding Cambodian population itself remained genetically rooted, overwhelmingly in its own indigenous Southeast Asian ancestry. Think about what this actually means for how we should understand one of the most significant cultural transformations in all of Southeast Asian history. For over a century, historians have debated exactly how Indian religious, administrative, and cultural influence managed to reshape Cambodian civilization so thoroughly, with theories ranging from large-scale Indian colonization and conquest on one end, to purely peaceful religious conversion carried by traveling merchants and Buddhist or Hindu missionaries on the other, with relatively little direct biological evidence available to definitively settle the debate one way or the other. This genetic evidence points toward something specific and considerably more nuanced than either extreme, a process driven by a real biologically confirmed migration of Indian men into Cambodian communities, but one that unfolded gradually through intermarriage and cultural integration rather than through any kind of large-scale population replacement or violent conquest. This pattern also helps explain something that had long puzzled historians examining the specific character of Cambodian Hinduism and Buddhism as they developed over the following centuries. Rather than simply replicating Indian religious practice wholesale, Cambodian religious tradition developed its own distinctive character, blending Hindu and Buddhist elements together in ways not commonly found on the Indian subcontinent itself, incorporating local Cambodian spiritual traditions, ancestor worship practices, and artistic conventions alongside the imported Indian religious framework. A pattern of relatively small numbers of Indian men marrying into and gradually becoming integrated within existing Cambodian communities fits this cultural outcome remarkably well, producing exactly the kind of blended, locally adapted religious and cultural tradition that emerges when a foreign tradition is carried forward primarily by descendants who are, by the very next generation, already predominantly local in their broader ancestry and daily cultural context, even while proudly maintaining specific inherited religious and administrative practices traced back to their paternal line. This same pattern likely explains why Cambodian temple architecture, while unmistakably drawing on Indian religious iconography and symbolic vocabulary, developed such a distinctive local style, incorporating motifs, building techniques, and artistic sensibilities that set Khmer temples apart quite clearly from anything found on the Indian subcontinent itself, produced by generations of builders and artisans who were, by ancestry, predominantly Cambodian, working within a religious framework their more distant paternal ancestors had originally introduced generations, and in some cases, centuries earlier. There is a broader historical pattern worth understanding here, because this specific genetic signature, substantial paternal ancestry from a distant source population paired with overwhelmingly local maternal ancestry, shows up repeatedly across numerous other well-documented historical migration events researchers have studied around the world. Long-distance trade in the ancient and medieval world was overwhelmingly conducted by men, often undertaking journeys that kept them away from their home communities and home populations for months or years at a time, occasionally settling permanently in the distant ports and inland trading centers they visited rather than returning home. This exact pattern has been documented among Arab and Persian trading communities that settled along the East African coast, among Chinese merchant communities that established themselves throughout Southeast Asia over the following centuries, and, as we discussed in a previous investigation on this channel, among the ancestors of South Africa's Lemba community, whose own DNA revealed an almost identical pattern of male-dominated migration, followed by intermarriage into a local population. Seeing the exact same genetic signature appear independently across such widely separated regions of the world, from southern Africa to mainland Southeast Asia, connected by nothing more than the shared underlying dynamics of ancient long-distance trade, offers a genuinely striking reminder of just how consistent certain patterns of human behavior have remained across vastly different cultures, centuries, continents, and circumstances throughout the whole of recorded and unrecorded human history alike. Cambodia's Indianization, viewed through this wider lens, was not some entirely unique or mysterious historical process. It was, at the level of underlying human behavior, a specific regional example of a pattern that repeated itself across many different parts of the ancient and medieval world, wherever long-distance maritime and overland trade routes brought traveling men into sustained contact with distant communities willing to welcome them, marry them, and eventually absorb their descendants, along with whatever religious, linguistic, or administrative traditions those descendants chose to carry forward into the fabric of the local population. So when someone asks whether ancient Cambodia's deep cultural connection to India reflects a genuine ancestral relationship, or simply a shared cultural and religious tradition adopted without any real exchange of people, the honest answer, based on everything this genetic research uncovered, is considerably more specific and considerably more historically revealing than either extreme position would suggest. The deep ancestral foundation of the Cambodian people remains overwhelmingly indigenous Southeast Asian, built from the same combination of ancient hunter-gatherer and incoming East Asian-related farming ancestry found across the wider mainland Southeast Asian region long before India ever entered the picture. But layered on top of that deep foundation, arriving specifically during the centuries when Sanskrit inscriptions and Hindu religious monuments first began appearing across the Cambodian landscape, sits a genuine, biologically confirmed, and specifically paternal genetic connection to South Asia, evidence of real Indian men who settled among Cambodian communities, married local women, and whose descendants carried forward the religious and cultural traditions that would eventually help produce one of the most magnificent architectural and artistic civilizations the ancient world ever built. That is the story this DNA research actually tells, and it is a far richer and far more historically precise story than the simplified picture most people carry around regarding the relationship between ancient India and ancient Cambodia. It is a story about how a relatively small number of individuals, traveling across an ocean for reasons that were almost certainly primarily economic rather than religious or political, ended up carrying an entire religious and administrative tradition halfway across Asia, planting it within a community that would go on to embrace, adapt, and ultimately transform it into something distinctively Cambodian, expressed most magnificently in the temples of Angkor that continue to draw millions of visitors from around the world today, most of whom walk through those towering stone corridors with little idea that the civilization responsible for building them carries, quite literally, a small but permanent thread of ancient Indian ancestry woven directly into its family tree. There is something worth sitting with here that extends beyond the specific genetic findings, something about how easily a purely cultural explanation for historical change can obscure a real underlying movement of actual human beings. For generations, the standard historical explanation for Cambodia's deep Indian cultural influence emphasized trade, religious conversion, and the voluntary adoption of foreign ideas by Cambodian elites eager to legitimize their own political power, using imported religious and administrative frameworks. That explanation was not wrong, but it was incomplete, describing the cultural mechanism through which Indian influence spread while leaving out the biological reality of the actual people who carried that influence across the ocean in the first place. Men whose names, individual stories, and specific origins within India are almost certainly lost to history forever, but whose genetic legacy survived clearly enough, encoded within the DNA of the people they married and the descendants those unions produced, for modern science to finally trace it back with real confidence more than 1,000 years later. There is one more detail from this research worth mentioning, because it adds an important layer of historical nuance often missing from popular discussions of ancient Indianization across Southeast Asia. The genetic evidence recovered from Cambodia fits into a considerably larger pattern that researchers have identified at various other sites across the wider region, including parts of what is now Vietnam, Thailand, and the Indonesian archipelago, all of which show broadly similar evidence of South Asian genetic influence arriving during roughly the same historical window, closely associated with the wider spread of Indian religious, linguistic, and administrative influence across mainland and maritime Southeast Asia during the early centuries of the first millennium CE. Cambodia was not an isolated case. It was one node within a much larger network of ancient maritime contact connecting India to communities scattered across an enormous stretch of Southeast Asian coastline and river systems, a network whose full genetic history researchers are still working to reconstruct in complete detail, one ancient burial site and one ancient genome at a time. If this video showed you anything, it is that the familiar cultural story surrounding one of history's most impressive civilizations can still hide a genuinely surprising biological reality underneath it, one that only becomes visible once researchers actually look directly at the DNA, rather than relying solely on inscriptions, temples, and historical texts. Angkor Wat's Hindu carvings and Sanskrit inscriptions have told historians a certain version of Cambodia's connection to India for well over a century. It took the DNA recovered from ordinary Cambodian burial sites to finally confirm that this connection ran considerably deeper than culture alone, reaching directly into the ancestry of the Cambodian people themselves, written not on any temple wall, but quietly preserved instead within their own DNA for well over 1,000 years, waiting patiently for modern science to finally arrive with the right tools and learn how to read it properly. There are other ancient civilizations out there with similarly famous cultural connections to distant regions, connections nobody has yet tested using the same kind of careful genetic investigation, connections that popular history has often reduced to a simple story of ideas traveling on their own, when the fuller, more human truth may well involve real men and women crossing real oceans, settling among strangers, and quietly becoming ancestors, to civilizations far from where their own individual journeys first began. If you want to know which civilization's hidden ancestral story gets uncovered next, make sure you are subscribed, because the next investigation in this series is already underway, and it is unlikely, based on everything we have found so far in this series, to be the simple cultural story anyone currently assumes it to be.